Welcome to Part B, Stage 2 of the Computer Simulation Project, which builds on the work presented in these previous videos. In Part A, the initial setup of the simulation was shown, and in Part B, Stage 1, a discussion of long-term cultural change was presented. It's recommended that these videos be watched before this one. There's links in the description. In this video, Part B, Stage 2, a simulation of short-term cultural change in a modern society will be presented, with a focus on the changes that results in a culture due to the different political parties that hold office during each election cycle. But before looking at the main focus of this video, here's a quick summary of the key elements of this computer simulation. Humans are represented in the simulation by what is referred to as humes, and each hume has a number of characteristics which include gender, age, type of thinker, and occupation. All the humes also have what can be referred to as neurochemical preferences. These preferences are simply brain processes that each hume enjoys stimulating on a regular basis, and they form what can be thought of as the disposition of each hume. So just as all real humans have a unique disposition that is formed by the areas of our brains we prefer to use and stimulate on a daily basis, so too do each of these simulated humans. So for this particular hume, the area of his brain that he has a first preference to stimulate is sensory awareness, represented by yellow, and his second brain preference is rationality, represented by blue. And for this other hume, her first brain preference is other awareness, in green, and her second preference is metaphysics, in purple. So together, the first and second neurochemical preferences are the main brain processes that form the disposition of a hume. And as with real humans, the disposition is the way in which they contribute to their culture, which is an important aspect of the simulation, as we'll see. Only the top two brain preferences are presented for each hume, as represented by the colour of their clothes. However, each hume has a unique value for each of the 7 key processes of their brains, which can change throughout their lives due to the influences that are acting on them. But the humes also have unique inherited brain preferences that don't change throughout their lives and can be thought of as part of their DNA. The values for each of these inherited processes are constant and are passed on to their children with a small amount of variation. So this is how humans are represented in the simulation. Now let's turn to the main focus of this Part B, Stage 2 video, which is a discussion of short-term cultural change in a modern culture, and which builds on the previous video on long-term cultural change during the European medieval period. The first obvious difference between this one and the previous video is the significant increase in the size of the simulated population. It has gone from about 1,000 individuals in the previous one to over 50,000 in this one. Consequently, it's no longer practical to display the individual humes in their houses or elsewhere. Rather, the size of the buildings indicates the number of individuals in each of them, as we see here. Despite the increase in the size of the population, however, all of the simulated humans still have a unique set of the characteristics previously described, which gives each of them a unique disposition. And it's their disposition that greatly informs how they vote in elections, particularly their first and second neurochemical preferences, as we'll see in a moment. To begin with, however, let's quickly run the simulation through the medieval time period that was covered in the previous video, but this time with the new display layout. So here's our stranded population of humes, who quickly constructed the buildings they needed to survive on the island, reproducing the same buildings and cultural activities as they moved into each new area. And here we have their first monarch in year 50 who has a disposition of dominance. He immediately pulls down the arts centre in area 2 and replaces it with an armoury. Then he establishes a large permanent army and goes to war. The next monarch has a neurochemical preference for other awareness, so he upgrades the hospital, the schools, and the orphanage, and in general promotes caregiving activities. And the next monarch has a disposition that favours sensory awareness, so she becomes a patron of the arts and increases the size of the arts centres. She also rebuilds the arts centre in Area 2 that her grandfather pulled down, and she commissions the building of the royal gardens. So in medieval times, the disposition of the ruling monarch strongly shapes the character of the culture, both in the short and long term. And in these types of cultures, nothing fundamentally changes for hundreds or even 1,000 years, as was the case in Europe, until we have the teaching of the new math based on the Hindu Arabic notation, as was described in the previous video. The teaching of the new math over the course of hundreds of years increases the prevalence of rational thinking across the European populations and results in a new scientific understanding of the natural world, which gave birth to the scientific revolution. And it was this scientific revolution that allowed for the development of new technology that had never been seen before. Hence, we see a rise in the science technology level of the culture. And importantly, as the science technology level increases, this makes new technology possible, which in turn increases the productivity of workers. This then reduces the number of workers needed and hence increases the profit margins for business owners. Consequently, the merchants and businessmen become wealthier each generation, and gradually they come to form what historians refer to as an influential bourgeois class. And it is this new cultural class, with a predominant disposition of self-awareness and rationality, and who want greater political representation, who now motivate the working class to revolt against the ruling class. So we have the French Revolution, inspired as it was by the American War of Independence. The French revolutionaries storm the palace. They remove the monarch and take control of the government. And so we see the beginning of the modern period and the start of democratically elected governments, which is the main focus of this video. So this video is about short-term change. But what is actually meant by short-term cultural change? Well, in the context of this simulation, it's the changes that occur within the election cycles of a modern culture. Each newly elected political party has specific policies and an underlying political philosophy that results in short-term changes to a culture. So what then are political parties at a fundamental level, and how do their philosophies and policies differ? The suggestion here is that all political parties have a biological basis, that they are the manifestation of the dispositions of specific groups of people in a culture. So when individuals with a similar disposition come together, they naturally create a worldview that reflects the dominant characteristics of their common disposition. And this worldview manifests as a specific set of ideas, practices, and procedures, each one of which constitutes a distinct political philosophy. So, for example, people with a first preference for self-awareness create a political philosophy based on individual freedom and civil rights and a free market economy. Whereas people with a first preference for other awareness stress the importance of the collective good over individual freedom and argue for the regulation of the economy for the benefit of the whole population. In most cases, however, most humans have a disposition that has a balance between self-awareness and other awareness. This is a consequence of evolution, as the need to be aware of our own personal condition and also the health and welfare of those close to us is necessary for the propagation of our species. So most members of any reproducing population can be represented in this way, as having a disposition with a balance of self-awareness and other awareness. And these individuals collectively manifest ideas related to the concerns of what's best for both individual freedom and the collective good, at least as much as is possible. So we have these three main groups of any population, which in modern democratic cultures create the three main types of political parties: a centre party, a right of centre party, and a left of centre party, each of which has a philosophy and a set of policies and programs, which are a manifestation of the dispositions of each corresponding group, as we see here. So, in regard to which of the three main political parties ends up governing a culture, this depends to a large extent on a portion of the centre party voters, who can swing either way from one election to the next. And this in turn depends on such things as the charisma of individual political leaders, the number of terms a party has been in power, and the current state of the economy. And importantly, it depends on whether an individual voter feels that their self-awareness and or other awareness have been stimulated enough by the policies of a particular party. This is because how we vote is based on what parts of our brains are triggered by the current or proposed policies of a political party, particularly our self-awareness and other awareness. But aside from the conflict between self-awareness and other awareness, there's one other area of dispositional conflict in both the individual and the population as a whole, which also informs politics. This is the tension between rationality and metaphysics. The rational and metaphysics neurochemical processes of the human brain play an important part in determining the character of every individual's disposition, and shape the way an individual thinks and feels about the world. A preference for rationality usually manifests as a secular worldview, and a preference for metaphysics manifests as a religious worldview. And these perspectives, in turn, influence the way an individual votes. Statistically speaking, people on the left of politics tend to have a secular worldview, and those on the right a religious one. So now, how can this representation of all the adult Humes in this simulation actually be used to simulate the modern political process? Let's look at a typical simulated election. First of all, the population is broken up into 16 electorates, 4 in each area, and each electorate has one representative from each of the main parties running for office. The voting population vote for one of the candidates based on their personal disposition. So the closer a voter's disposition is to a particular candidate's disposition, in their electorate, the more likely they are to vote for them. And the candidate who gets the most votes wins and now represents the electorate. So we have a direct correspondence between the dispositions of the Humes in each electorate and the type of political representative they choose. After the vote is taken, we end up with 16 representatives, any one of which could come from any of the three main parties. And the party with the most representatives wins the election and forms government. This then is the basic setup of the election process. So let's run the simulation now from the start of the modern era and see what the results are for each election cycle. An election is held every 4 years. So the political revolution has just occurred. And now we see that the centre party wins the very first election held, and it continues winning the first few elections as the culture establishes itself at the beginning of the modern era, instituting basic moderate policies and programs, such as the construction of roads, public parks, and other infrastructure projects, and the creation of modern civil institutions. It's not until the election of year of 204 that we see a change of government. The right of centre party wins office, and it wins again in year 208. Now in year 212, we have the centre party back in. Then in year 216, the left of centre is in. No doubt you've noticed the changing colours and sizes of many of the buildings. The colour changes are simply due to the old medieval buildings in navy blue reaching 50 years old and being replaced with modern buildings. But the changing sizes of the buildings is due to the changes in government each 4 years. This is an important aspect of the simulation of short-term cultural change, as the changes in the sizes of the buildings is a consequence of the way in which each political party distributes its government revenue. So here we see, first of all, the yearly collection of government revenue based on the taxation rates of each party. The rates reflect the philosophy of a party. The right of centre party believes in a lower taxation rate for middle and high income earners, and the left of centre party believes in a high tax rate for these income groups, while the centre party takes a middle road in regard to taxation. And the political philosophy of each party is also reflected in the distribution of taxation revenue as shown here. The most obvious difference is in the distribution of revenue to the social welfare and education institutions, and in particular, the changing level of funding for public and private institutions, as we'll see in a moment. There's also a significant difference in the amount of funding directed to the military by each party, and funding used to incentivise business enterprise. We also see varying funding for the arts and culture, as the right of politics usually don't believe in government funding for these areas and don't want to see government grants for artists and writers, whereas the left of politics takes the opposite view and the centre party once again takes a middle position. So let's return to the simulation and see the consequences of these varying distributions of government revenue. It's clearer to see what's actually happening by focusing on just one area. So in the simulated year of 228, we see that the right of centre party wins office and it imposes its political philosophy, policies and programs onto the culture. This results in a reduction in the size of government departments, a reduction in funding for public schools and government child and aged care centres, and a reduction in funding for the arts. And it also results in an increase in funding for private schools, private child and aged care centres, and for the military. The party also wins a second term. Then in year 236, the centre party gets back in office and we see a resetting of government funding. That goes back to a moderate balanced position. They also win a second term. Now in year 244, the left of centre party wins the election, and it also imposes its political philosophy onto the culture. This results in an increase in funding for government departments and for public schools, government child and aged care centres, and the arts, and a reduction in funding for private schools and private child and aged care centres, and also a reduction in funding for the military. The party wins a second term and then a third term, which is rare in the politics of modern societies. And it adds 2 more government offices during its third term to increase the number of government programs. Then, in the year 256 election, the centre party returns to office. And once again, we see a rebalance of government funding to the moderate position. And in the next election, the right of centre party takes office, and we see that once again it reduces funding for all government institutions and increases funding for private institutions and the military. And when they win a second term, they take the reduction of government funding even further by demolishing the government buildings built by the left of centre party, and by retrenching the public servants that worked in the offices, as we'll see in more detail in a moment. So as we continue running the simulation, we see the same oscillation occurring between an increase or decrease of government funding for public and private institutions, and the arts, and the military. And this also applies to the funding of public and private hospitals, and to public and private universities, as we see here. Consequently, these election results, which correspond to the size of the dispositional groups of the population over the course of 100 years, result in tangible changes to the culture through a 4-year election cycle. And the way in which the changing levels of government funding, policies and programs impacts the lives of the simulated humans can be seen clearer through the use of this new graph, which displays the number of Humes in specific occupations by year. The graph shows a range of information over the course of the first 100 years of the modern era, so from about year 200 to about year 300. Here we have the major events that have occurred during this time, from wars to famines and infectious diseases. Famines are very rare in modern cultures, but major infectious diseases continue to occur about every 20 years on average. Here we have which political party is governing the culture each election cycle, which will be either the centre party, or the right of centre party, or the left of centre, and the number of terms they win. And over here we have what type of occupation data the graph will be showing as a percentage of the total working population. So this will allow us to see the fluctuating numbers of employed humans in specific occupations throughout the course of the first century of the modern era, and how the funding and policies of each particular governing party affects these occupation numbers. So let's first of all look at the numbers related to caregivers, starting with the number of doctors and nurses who are working in public and private hospitals, as we see here. We can see that when the centre political party is in office, their funding level for hospitals results in about an 11% employment rate for public doctors and nurses, and a 3% rate for private doctors and nurses. Then, when the left of centre party gains office, the number of private hospital doctors and nurses reduces to about 2%, and the number of public hospital doctors and nurses increases to about 13%. And then when the right of centre party gains office, the number of public hospital staff reduces to about 9%, and the private hospital staff rises to 6%. And we see this same basic pattern occurring throughout the century as political parties win and lose elections. Now let's see how another caregiving type of occupation fared, that of the teaching profession. Once again, the same fluctuating pattern is occurring for public and private school teachers. The funding level of the centre party creates a baseline for the number of teachers at each type of school. Then the left of centre party increases funding for public schools, which results in more public school teachers, and decreases funding for private schools. And when the right of centre party gets in, they reverse the funding levels, and hence we see the number of public school teachers go down, and the number of private school teachers go up. And this pattern continues on for the rest of the century, as political parties come and go. Another type of caregiving occupation is that of public servants. It may not appear obvious that public servants can be seen as caregivers, but almost all government programs and policies are directed towards caring for and improving the lives of all members of a population, and hence government is a manifestation of other awareness. Therefore, public servants are in this sense also caregiving agents, and this is supported by seeing the same fluctuating results in the number of public servants corresponding to which political party is in office, and the party's attitude to the size of government. So the left of centre party increases government spending, and we see an increase in public servant numbers, and the right of centre party reduces funding, and consequently the number of public servants goes down. And once again, this pattern continues on for the rest of the century as political parties continue to change. And in regard to military spending, which is an area of government spending that is a manifestation of dominance, we see the soldier numbers for each successive party here. And the fluctuating numbers once again reflects the amount of funding each party chooses to allocate to the armed forces. Except that, in this case, it's a reversal of the previous fluctuations. A left of centre party reduces funding to the military, so we see a reduction in soldier numbers. And the right of centre party increases funding, and hence we see an increase in soldier numbers. And in contrast, we once again have a reversal of the situation for the number of artists, entertainers, and writers, as each political party varies its level of funding for the arts and culture in general. The left increases funding, and the right decreases funding. And these changing levels of funding particularly affect small theatres, festivals, and cultural groups that usually rely on government funding to continue operating. And finally now, let's look at the total combined numbers of humans employed in the main occupational groups who are affected by government policies and funding, starting with the combined other awareness occupations for public sector jobs. This includes all the caregivers at public hospitals, schools, universities, care centres, and government offices, such as doctors, nurses, teachers, child and aged carers, and public servants. And once again, we see the familiar pattern of fluctuating numbers, up during the left of centre terms and down during the right of centre terms. Now we see the numbers for those counterpart occupations in the private caregiving sector, without the public servants. So all the caregivers at private hospitals, schools, universities and care centres, such as doctors, nurses, teachers, child and aged carers. And it's important to note that these occupations in the private sector are both manifestations of self-awareness and of other awareness. This is because the individuals who go to private hospitals or care centres or send their children to private schools or private universities are making a personal decision to do so, due to the fact that they prefer to have their self-awareness neurochemical processes stimulated. And even the staff who work in these caregiving places, while manifesting other awareness by helping the patients or students, are also conscious of the fact that they are working in a place that stimulates self-awareness. And quite often these staff members make a conscious decision themselves to work in a private institution. Hence, private caregiving institutions manifest both self-awareness and other awareness. And as we see here, they are also susceptible to the specific policies of each newly elected party. The numbers are down due to the left of centre policies, and the numbers are up due to the policies of the right of centre party. And now we have the numbers for the manifestation of dominance. These are all the military personnel who work for the armed forces, which includes soldiers, military officers, generals, and all the admin staff. And finally, we see once again the numbers for those individuals who work in the creative industries, such as artists, entertainers, and writers, and that receive a large amount of government funding. This is an occupational group that manifests sensory awareness and social intelligence, and as expected, the same basic pattern can be seen. And this pattern of occupation numbers through the first century of the modern era continues on through the next century. As each newly elected government continues to impose its political philosophy on the culture through its distribution of taxation revenue and its selective funding of specific cultural activities, sectors, and institutions during each election cycle. In summary then, this computer simulation of short-term cultural change has shown how the dispositions of a population of simulated humans can directly influence the character of their culture. The number of Humes at any time with a particular disposition determines what type of political party is elected to office, and the elected party then imposes the dispositional worldview of its supporters onto the culture as a whole by the allocation of resources to selective cultural areas. So we have an increase in resources to caregiving institutions, resulting in the greater manifestation of other awareness. And a greater allocation of resources to business and private institutions increases the prevalence of self-awareness in the culture. And an increase in resources to the military results in a greater manifestation of dominance. A greater expenditure on the arts, leading to a manifestation of sensory awareness and social intelligence. And an increased funding for science and technology, resulting in the greater manifestation of rationality, and so on. But there is one other important way in which the disposition of individuals can shape the character of their culture, and that's through the type of goods and services they purchase. And this will be the topic of the next video. Bye for now.